All right, this is the first lecture in Introduction to Ethics. I want to cover a couple of topics that Russ Schaefer Landau discusses in the introduction to our textbook, Fundamentals of Ethics. In the introduction to Fundamentals of Ethics, which is the first of our readings, Schaefer Landau covers two basic topics that I want to talk about in this lecture and in the next lecture. One topic has to do with the nature of morality and knowledge. So a couple of different claims about the possibility of moral knowledge are discussed by Schaefer Landau in the introduction, and that's the issue that I'm going to discuss right now. And then in the other main topic in the introduction is an overview of some basics of logic. And in the next lecture, I'll spend some time introducing you to the basics of logic, because many of the arguments that we will study in the class are presented in a few basic forms of deductive argument, and it'll be helpful to have some understanding of how it is in philosophy we go about evaluating arguments, how we go about identifying arguments, and most of the class will focus on critical thinking about arguments in the area of ethics, critical thinking and critical analysis of arguments presented on different sides of different ethical questions. So in order to evaluate arguments, you have to have some familiarity with at least some of the basics of logic, so I'll spend some time on that in the second lecture. So two lectures here on the introduction to the fundamentals of ethics. I'm going to cover two of the main topics that Schaefer Landau discusses in his introduction. Let's start with this first topic, morality and knowledge, or the possibility of moral knowledge, we might say. Do we have moral knowledge, or is moral knowledge possible? Is a philosophical, do we have moral knowledge is a philosophical question that we're going to spend some time on now. Here's one way to think about the issue. I'll oftentimes in this class ask students, do you think some particular kind of act is right or wrong? And students will oftentimes say, it depends. I'll say, really? What does it depend on? Oftentimes they'll say it depends on what the individual believes. Is that true? Let's think critically about that claim. It's certainly a widely held view that is true, that when it comes to questions of right and wrong, or when it comes to questions of good and bad, these kinds of questions depend on the individual's belief about them. In general, that's not true when it comes to any branch of knowledge. Now, it certainly is a widely held view, though, that there are no objective truths when it comes to matters of right and wrong, good and bad. But let's spend some time thinking about what reasons people might have for believing that, and let's think critically about whether the reasons that people oftentimes have for believing that are good reasons. I'll cover some of the most common arguments for that view, and what we'll see in this first lecture is that with respect to the most common arguments for that view, none of them are good arguments. Here again, you certainly encounter this view a lot. It's certainly a widely held view that there are no objective truths in matters of right and wrong, good and bad. So what do I mean here when I say there are no objective truths? Well, here again, when you say, if I ask you, is a certain kind of act right or wrong, and you say it depends, that seems like an odd thing to say, because we wouldn't say that, at least looking at it a certain way, that seems like kind of an odd thing to say, because we wouldn't say that in other branches of knowledge. So if I asked you, is water H2O, It would seem strange to say, it would be a strange answer for somebody to say, well, it depends on what the individual believes about it. Is that true? Can the molecular composition of water be influenced by what anyone believes about it? If I were to ask you, is Earth the third planet from the sun? Here again, it would be an odd thing to say if one were to reply, well, it depends. Really? It depends on what? Well, it depends on the individual's beliefs about it. Does it? Really? An individual's belief about that can change the position of the Earth relative to the sun, can change the position of Mercury and Venus relative to the sun, just because there's somebody who has a different belief about it? No, we wouldn't say that in any other branch of knowledge. If I asked you, does 2 plus 2 equal 4? Here again, it would be odd to say it depends. Really? Does it? What does it depend on? It depends on the individual's beliefs about that? Really? If the truth of that statement depended on what the individual believes about it, then presumably all kinds of statements about the value of 2 plus 2 could be true. And yet that's not the case. There's only one statement that correctly expresses the value of 2 plus 2. So why would we say that when it comes to questions of right and wrong? Why would we adopt this attitude when it comes to ethical matters? Why would we adopt this attitude when it comes to morals, questions having to do with right and wrong, good and bad? Someone might hold the view that morality or ethics is simply not a branch of knowledge. Okay, that's one possibility. But is that true? Is it true that we don't have any knowledge about right and wrong? Is it true that we don't have any knowledge about good and bad? Again, you certainly do encounter that view a lot. It's a widely held view that there are no objective truths in matters of right and wrong and matters of good and bad. But is that view correct? Is that true? There are two different philosophical theses one could consider when it comes to this question about the possibility of moral knowledge. One thesis would be what I would call the Objectivist Thesis. And the thesis would be that there are objective moral truths. That is to say, moral truths that do not depend on the individual's beliefs. That's what I mean here by objective. Now, somebody who denies that there is knowledge when it comes to matters of right and wrong, when it comes to matters of ethics or matters of morals, might defend this non-objectivist thesis, or what it's also called the Subjectivist Thesis. And that claim would be that there are no objective moral truths. Right and wrong simply depend on the individual's beliefs. Non-objectivism denies that. Here again, denies that we have any moral knowledge, denies that there are any objective moral truths. So one way to understand the non-objectivist claim or the subjectivist claim would be this. Somebody who takes that view would be saying that the same act in the same circumstances can be right for me and wrong for you, or right for you but wrong for me. So this is how the non-objectivist, or what is also called the subjectivist view, is oftentimes presented. Somebody will say, well, maybe it's right for me and wrong for you, or maybe that's right for you and wrong for me. Is that possible? Here again, we wouldn't say that in any other branch of knowledge. And it is arguably the case that we do have moral knowledge. So objectivism, by way of contrast with non-objectivism, here again, objectivism would be one way to present it, one way to understand it would be to say that objectivism denies that that's true. That is to say, denies that it's possible that X is right for you but wrong for me, or right for me but wrong for you. According to objectivism, the same act in the same circumstances, here again we have to specify that we're talking about the same circumstances, same kinds of circumstances. Of course, if you change the circumstances, then yeah, a certain kind of act could be right or wrong if you change the circumstances. Of course, that's uncontroversial. But the non-objectivist goes further than that. The non-objectivist says the very same act in the very same circumstances can be right for you and wrong for me. or right for you, but wrong for me. But objectivism denies that that's possible. According to objectivism, the same act in the same circumstances is objectively right or wrong. Its rightness or wrongness doesn't depend on your beliefs, or your values, or your attitudes, or your preferences, or your likes or dislikes. The objective truth of the matter is not in any way influenced by what any particular individual believes about it. Here again, this is characteristic of any branch of knowledge. And there's an argument to be made that it is true about morality as well, and that is the objectivist view. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean by this distinction between objective truths and subjective truths, or what are sometimes called objective truth claims versus subjective truth claims. What would be an example of an objective truth? The movie was hilarious. Let's contrast that claim with a merely subjective claim. Somebody might say, I laughed from the beginning to the end of the movie. Now, with respect to this subjective truth claim, the individual is simply reporting his own experience. He's not making, or she's not making, any objective claim. She's limiting her claim to her own experience, and that's in the nature of subjective truths. And I would say that is a kind of truth, because you can't be wrong about your own experience. You can't be wrong about what you experienced. Obviously, you know that. If you say I laughed from the beginning to the end of the movie, obviously you can't be wrong about that. But when we go from that subjective claim to the claim the movie was hilarious, now you're making a statement that isn't limited to your own personal experience. Now you're making an objective claim. And you could be right or wrong about that. Here again, with respect to the merely subjective statement, I laughed from the beginning to the movie to the end of the movie. Of course, you can't be wrong about that. But if you're the only person who had that reaction to the movie, and you go from your own subjective experience to saying the movie was hilarious, then you're wrong. If no one else would have that reaction to the movie, then you're wrong. Now, you can't be wrong about what you experienced, but you can be wrong about the objective claim. The movie was hilarious. If you're the only one who laughed, then that's not true. Because an objective claim makes a kind of general claim. It makes a claim about how, in general, people will experience something. And that kind of claim is not just limited to your own experience. Let's consider another example. An objective truth or an objective truth claim would be, it's warm in here. By way of contrast, a merely subjective claim would be something like, it feels warm in here, or maybe it feels warm in here to me. Now here again, it feels warm in here simply reports one's own experience. And so that's why I say that's a subjective claim. Now here again, you can't be wrong about that. You can't be wrong about how it feels to you, about how the temperature of the room feels to you. Of course, you can't be wrong about that. But when you go from this statement that merely has to do with your own experience, in this case, your own feeling, to the statement, it's warm in here. Now this general statement, this statement that claims to discover or that claims to present an objective truth, that statement is not limited to any individual's experience. That's a kind of objective claim. And here again, you could be wrong about that. If everyone else in the room is shivering, then, and you, here again, believe that it's warm in the room, then that's not true. Your own experience in this case is not representative of how, in general, people would experience the temperature of the room. Maybe you have the flu and you have the fever, so it feels warm in the room to you, but that is a condition that is distorting your ability to perceive temperature accurately. Everyone else in the room who is able to make a normal perceptual judgment because they're not sick judges the room not to be warm. So here again, you could be wrong about the objective truth claim. You can't be wrong about how something feels to you, but you can be wrong about the objective truth claim. Let's consider another example. An objective truth or an objective truth claim would be that the soup is too salty. Let's contrast that with a merely subjective claim. You might say the soup tastes too salty, or the soup tastes too salty to me. However you want to say it, you're simply making a statement that is limited to your own individual experience. And of course, you can't be wrong about that. Here again, you can't be wrong about how something tastes to you. But when we go from our own individual experience to an objective claim, now we're making, here again, a kind of claim that is not limited to your own experience. You're making the claim that in general, people will find that to be the case. An objective claim is a kind of general claim. So when you say the soup is too salty, you're making a kind of objective claim, and it's not limited in the statement. It's not restricted to your own individual experience. And here again, you could be right or wrong about that. If you're the only one who finds it to be too salty, here again, maybe for some reason or another, you're not perceiving accurately. So you could be wrong about that objective claim. There is an objective fact of the matter as to whether the soup is too salty. There is an objective fact of the matter as to whether it's warm in a room. There is an objective fact of the matter as to whether a movie is hilarious. And the objective fact of the matter is not influenced by any particular individual's subjective experience, because it's in the nature of objective claims that they're general claims. All right, so here would be some examples, here again, of objective truth claims. Objects fall when dropped. That's an objective claim. And what I mean by objective here is that the truth of that claim doesn't depend on anyone's beliefs about it. If somebody does not believe that an object will fall when dropped, then they're wrong. Their disbelief does not in any way influence the fact of the matter. A straight line is the shortest one between 2 points. That is an objective truth claim. A human being cannot eat a bulldozer. That is an objective truth claim, and indeed, I would say an objective truth. It doesn't matter whether anyone disbelieves that statement. Somebody's beliefs about that statement do not in any way influence the objective fact of human biology, that a human being cannot metabolize the materials from which a bulldozer is constructed, or at least not in the massive quantities that it would take to actually eat a bulldozer. Somebody may disbelieve that statement. Somebody may want it to be true that a human being can eat a bulldozer, but no one's beliefs about it in any way influence the objective truth of the matter. Giraffes do not have 9 legs is an objective truth claim. Here again, the truth of these claims doesn't depend on anyone's beliefs or values or attitudes or likes or dislikes. In each of these cases, what anyone believes about it is not going to influence the objective truth of the matter. There are certain biological truths about giraffes. For example, they do not have 9 legs. And some of those biological truths have to be discovered by an empirical science like biology. And when we recognize that they have to be discovered, we realize that here again, no one's beliefs about what the truth is can influence what the truth is. There are objective truths to be discovered about the anatomy and the physiology and biochemistry, so forth, of giraffes. Believing any particular proposition about giraffes does not, simply in virtue of the fact that somebody believes it, make it true. So it's in the nature of objective truth claims that they don't depend on anyone's beliefs, values, attitudes, likes, or dislikes. Let's consider some other objective truth claims. Now, in the case of the previous statement, I would go further than saying that these are objective truth claims. I would say that these are objective truths, and that these are objective truths is absolutely uncontroversial. It would be simply false to deny the truth of any, you would simply be wrong to deny the truth of any of these claims. That's all there is to it. These are objective truths. Now, it is arguably the case. I want to consider a number of objective truth claims. I'm not going to argue at the moment that these are objective truths, but they are statements that make a objective claim. That is to say, the person making these statements is asserting that these are objective truths. So, for example, the statement, murder is wrong. Now, I said at the beginning of this discussion that there's disagreement about this issue, whether statements about right and wrong can be objectively true, whether there is knowledge when it comes to right and wrong. But it is arguably the case that murder is wrong is an objectively true statement, and that we can come to know that it is true. It is arguably the case that that is an objective truth. There's an argument to be made that claims about right and wrong, claims about good and bad, claims about values, such as beauty, are also objective in this same sense that I've been using the word objective. Here again, what I mean by that is that their truth doesn't depend on anyone's beliefs, values, attitudes, etc. Here again, objects fall when dropped. If someone disbelieves that, his believing that it's not true cannot in any way influence the fact of the matter. Now, with respect to a statement like murder is wrong, many students will point out that there are people who don't believe that, such as murderers, or serial killers, or something like that. But here again, we wouldn't say in any other branch of knowledge that because somebody disbelieves that, say, for example, objects fall when dropped, or Earth is the third planet from the sun, or water is H2O. In no other branch, or here again in the case of math, 2 + 2 = 4, we wouldn't say in any other branch of knowledge that because somebody disbelieves it, that somehow makes it no longer an objective truth. Why should we say that about morality? Why should we say that about right and wrong? It's not clear that there's any good reason for thinking that we have to say that. It is arguably the case that murder is wrong is an objectively true statement. Sometimes we make value judgments. What was a good movie? What was a good book? What was a great movie? What was a great book? Who was a great baseball player or basketball player? Who was the greatest baseball player or basketball player? All these are value judgments, aren't they? And here again, when it comes to value judgments, when it comes to values, we're in the domain of ethics. And of course, we make value judgments in lots of areas of life, not just in ethics. So in sports, for example, a statement like Babe Ruth was the greatest baseball player. That's a kind of value judgment. That's a statement about who was the best. And it is arguably the case that that statement is objectively true. Here again, there are people who disbelieve that. But we would not say in any other branch of knowledge that just because somebody disbelieves that objects fall when dropped, or disbelieves that water is H2O, or disbelieves that 3 + 2 = 5, that therefore the fact of the matter is changed because there's somebody who holds a contrary belief. We wouldn't say that in any other branch of knowledge. It is arguably the case that Babe Ruth was the greatest baseball player. Many baseball historians would argue that that is an objective truth. Obviously, it's more debatable than something like water is H2O. Baseball historians would disagree on something like who was the greatest player of all time, but there are very strong arguments for Babe Ruth. It is arguably the case that the statement Babe Ruth was the greatest baseball player is an objective truth. There are many arguments that baseball historians would give in support of that claim. They would point to the fact that he hit 714 home runs. That was the record for a long time. He retired from playing in 1935, and that remained the home run record until it was broken by Hank Aaron in 1974. So that was the record for a long, long time. He had the most home runs for a long time. He is still the all-time leader in slugging percentage in the whole history of the game. No one has recorded a higher slugging percentage in his career than Babe Ruth did. Slugging percentage is the percentage of your hits that are extra base hits. He's still the all-time leader in slugging percentage. Now, you could make arguments for other candidates for greatest baseball player of all time. Of course, baseball historians would disagree, could disagree about that. You might make an argument for Ty Cobb. It's true Ty Cobb had a higher career batting average than Babe Ruth. He hit .367. That was his career batting average. And it's true that Ty Cobb had more hits than Babe Ruth. He had 4,191 hits in his career. So by some measures, Ty Cobb was a better player. He had more stolen bases than Babe Ruth, of course. Ty Cobb had 892 stolen bases in his career, and that stood as the record for a long, long time. So you could make a case for Ty Cobb as well. But I think most baseball historians would come down on the side of saying that Babe Ruth was the greatest player ever, because not only was he a great hitter, not only was he one of the greatest hitters ever. Here again, 714 home runs was the career record for a long time, and he still holds the record for slugging percentage. But not only was Babe Ruth a great hitter, he was also a great pitcher. And he's really the only player in the history of Major League Baseball you can say that about. His career win-loss record was 94-46. So that's a very good win-loss record. His career earned run average, his career ERA was 2.28. So those are still some of the best pitching records as well. So most baseball historians would come down on the side of saying Babe Ruth was the greatest baseball player. So there's a lot of evidence that you can give for the truth of that claim. And there are strong arguments that you can give for the truth of that claim. That's why it is arguably the case that that is an objective truth. Judgments about beauty, such as what is a beautiful painting, or a beautiful sculpture, or a beautiful poem, or a beautiful movie, or beautiful novel. It is arguably the case that here again there is knowledge about these kinds of judgments as well. People who study, whether it be poetry or literature or the fine arts, have a lot of evidence that they can give in support of these kinds of claims. And it is arguably the case that objective knowledge is possible in this area as well. Beauty is not simply in the eye of the beholder. Somebody can be an expert on, somebody can become very knowledgeable about the expression of beauty in different media, in different creative arts, music, here again, painting and sculpture, literature, and so forth. So a statement like "Somewhere I Have Never Traveled," the poem by E.E. Cummings, "Somewhere I Have Never Traveled" is a beautiful poem. It is arguably the case that that is an objective truth. Someone who studies poetry, knows a lot about it, and has good judgment in that domain has a kind, it is arguably the case that that person has a kind of knowledge. So these are all objective truth claims. When somebody says murder is wrong, when somebody asserts that Babe Ruth was the greatest player, when somebody asserts "Somewhere I've Never Traveled" is a beautiful poem, they are making objective truth claims. Certainly, they are claiming that those statements are objectively true. And it is arguably the case that they're right about that. So let's think a little bit more about this difference between subjective truths and objective truths. Here again, subjective truths are statements that are true of the individual's experience. And of course, you can't be wrong about how something feels or seems or tastes to you. So here again, in the domain of beauty, judgments about beauty in the arts, say for example, someone might say the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You certainly hear that kind of claim often. The implication would be that statements about beauty are only subjective truths. But it's arguably the case that that's not correct. It is arguably the case that there is objective knowledge to be had. There are objective truths to be discovered in those domains as well. And that is true when it comes to morality, which is our focus here as well. Because when I claim that the movie is hilarious, or that it's warm in here, or that the soup is too salty, now I'm making a claim about objective truth, and the implication of such statements is that my judgment isn't idiosyncratic. What do I mean by an idiosyncratic judgment? I might say, for example, that mustard on ice cream is good. That would be an idiosyncratic judgment. It would be limited to my experience and maybe the experience of a few other peculiar individuals. Generally speaking, people will not find that to be the case. So my judgment in that area would be idiosyncratic if I did indeed like mustard on ice cream, which I don't, but it's just an example of what would be an idiosyncratic judgment. When I say here again, what would be a merely subjective claim? A merely subjective claim would be, for example, I like mustard on ice cream. Now, when I make that claim, of course, I can't be wrong. That's in the nature of subjective truths. They're simply limited to the individual's experience, simply limited in that case to my experience. And of course, you can't be wrong about your own experience. You can't be wrong about how something tastes to you. But if I go from I like mustard on ice cream, and here again, I can't be wrong about that, to the statement mustard on ice cream is good, now I've made a false statement. Because the second statement makes a kind of objective claim. When I say mustard on ice cream is good, I am asserting that in general, people will find that to be a good combination. But that's not true. In general, people will not find that to be a good combination. They will not find that to be something that tastes good. So if that were true of me, then my judgment would be idiosyncratic. But when we make objective claims, the implication of such statements is that my judgment isn't idiosyncratic. When I say mustard on ice cream is good, I'm implying by saying that my judgment is not peculiar, unusual. But in that case, I would be wrong. Because in that case, my judgment is idiosyncratic. So that's one way to think about the difference between subjective claims and objective claims. When I make a claim about objective truth, I'm making a general claim. I'm claiming that the object has properties that would cause people generally to have the same kind of experience. Here again, a merely subjective claim would be, I like mustard on ice cream. But when I go from that to mustard on ice cream is good, now I'm making a general claim. I'm claiming that in general, people would have that experience of finding it to be good. But again, that's not true. When it comes to an objective claim, I could be wrong. And in that particular case, I would be wrong. Okay, so I've laid out the difference between this objectivist view about moral knowledge and this subjectivist view about moral knowledge. Now let's consider some reasons that people have for thinking that there is no objective moral knowledge to be discovered. Why do people think right and wrong depends on what the individual believes about it? One sometimes hears reasons offered in support of non-objectivism, but let me ask this. Are they good reasons? Are they reasons that really support the non-objectivist thesis? That is the claim that there are no objective moral truths. Here's one way that people will sometimes argue for the non-objectivist position, the position that there are no objective moral truths. Sometimes you'll hear someone argue for non-objectivism by claiming that morality is a matter of opinion. Okay, well, I want to suggest that that's not a good argument. Because even if that were true, even if it were true that morality involves matters of opinion, the non-objectivist conclusion wouldn't follow. It wouldn't therefore follow that there is no moral knowledge to be discovered. Here's a counterexample to that argument, an argument of exactly the same form that is obviously not a good argument. Somebody could just as easily say that there are matters of opinion in science. Therefore, there are no objective scientific truths. But would anyone believe that? Would anyone believe that science has discovered nothing? Science has not discovered that water is H2O. Science has not discovered that the Earth is the third planet from the sun? No, nobody would believe, virtually nobody, I take it, would believe that there are no objective scientific truths that have been discovered. Here again, here's another counterexample to that argument. Somebody might, by that same logic, somebody could say, well, there are matters of opinion in math, therefore there are no objective mathematical truths. But here again, does anyone believe that there are no objective mathematical truths? Does anyone believe that 2 + 2 = 4 is a matter of opinion? There are matters of opinion in science and math as well. That's why this is not a good argument. There are matters of opinion in every branch of knowledge. So even if it were true that there were matters of opinion about morality, it wouldn't follow that morality is not a branch of knowledge. There are matters of opinion in science and math as well. Lack of knowledge in any area doesn't mean that there's no point to trying to discover the truth. Lack of knowledge in any area doesn't mean that rational inquiry is pointless. For one thing, even about matters of opinion, of course, there may be right and wrong answers. We just don't know what they are. From the fact that something is a matter of opinion, it doesn't follow that there's no true opinion. There are matters of opinion, of course. There are areas where we wouldn't say that we have knowledge. But from the fact that it's a matter of opinion, it doesn't follow that there's no true opinion. There may be knowledge to be discovered, even in areas that we now regard as matters of opinion. From the fact that no opinion is known to be right, it doesn't follow that there is no right opinion. From the fact that something is a matter of opinion, all that follows is that we don't know which opinion is the right opinion. But that doesn't mean there's no objective truth to be discovered. So consider some examples. The Earth orbits the sun. Sirius is 200 million years old. Sirius is the star that's closest to us after our sun. Our sun is a star. The sun of our planetary system is a star. And the next closest star to us after our sun is Sirius. And here would be a scientific judgment about the age of Sirius. Sirius is 200 million years old. Consider this example. Water is composed of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Consider this mundane example, simply an example from daily experience. The Cowboys will win the game tomorrow. I want to suggest that some of these statements were once matters of opinion, but then they became matters of fact. Others, of course, are still matters of opinion, but they may become matters of fact. So if the Cowboys are playing tomorrow, and I believe right now that the Cowboys will win the game tomorrow, well, of course that's only an opinion. I can't say that I know they will win the game before the game has been played, of course. But if I say the Cowboys will win the game tomorrow, and then tomorrow comes and they do win the game, my opinion on the previous day, my opinion was true. My opinion was a true opinion. So from the fact that something is a matter of opinion, it doesn't follow that it's not true. It doesn't follow that there's no objective truth about the subject to be discovered. So some of these statements were once matters of opinion, but then became matters of fact. That's another reason why this argument is not a good argument. If one were to argue, look, there aren't any objective moral truths because morality is about matters of opinion. That's not a good argument, for one thing, because many matters of opinion have become matters of fact. So the statement that the Earth orbits the sun, that was a matter of opinion for a long time. It's now an established fact. But here again, even when it was merely a matter of opinion, it was true. When Copernicus in the 15th century defended the position that the Earth orbits the sun, he was right. Most people, including most astronomers, did not agree with him about that at that time, but they were wrong. He was right. He couldn't prove it at that time, so it was a matter of opinion, but he was right. Eventually it was proven. Sirius is 200 million years old. That would be an example of a matter of opinion in astronomy. Astronomers disagree about the age of Sirius. But look, there is an objective fact of the matter to be discovered. There is some number of years old that Sirius is. Yes, it's a matter of opinion. We couldn't say that we know, but it doesn't follow from that fact that no opinion is the true opinion. Some opinion about the age of Sirius is true. Maybe this one, Sirius is 200 million years old. That might be the true opinion. So even if it is a matter of opinion, it doesn't follow that it can't become a matter of fact. And it doesn't follow that there's no objective truth to be discovered about that. The statement that water is composed of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. For most of the history of chemistry, that would have been a matter of opinion. For most of the history of chemistry, it was believed that water is an element. It's a relatively recent discovery that water is a compound, that water is composed of elements. That was a matter of opinion for a long time. Now it is an established fact. But even when it was a matter of opinion, even when it hadn't been proven, that was a true opinion. It was simply a true opinion that was not yet known to be true. So this is not a good argument. If one were to argue, well, look, there isn't any such thing as moral knowledge. There aren't any objective moral truths, because morality is about matters of opinion. That's not a good argument. Because even if it is about matters of opinion, it doesn't follow that there's no true opinion. It doesn't follow that there's no objective truth to be discovered about the issue. And for one thing, many matters of opinion have become matters of fact. So there you have a few reasons for seeing that that's not a good argument. We can evaluate the evidence or the reasons on which one bases an opinion, and this evaluation is not itself a matter of opinion. So from the fact that something is a matter of opinion rather than a matter of fact, of course it doesn't follow that every opinion is equally well justified. It doesn't follow that every opinion is equally well supported by evidence or reasons. So even if this is another reason that this is not a good argument, even if it's true that morality involves matters of opinion, still some opinions are better justified than others, are more strongly supported by evidence and reasons than others. And here again, that's an issue that has to do with logic. We know a lot about logic. It may be true that morality doesn't here again, let me start that again. It may well be true that oftentimes when it comes to moral judgments, we are in the area of matters of opinion rather than matters of fact. But again, it doesn't follow that every opinion is equally well supported by evidence or reasons. So let's just think of an example. Let's go back to this example. The Cowboys will win the game tomorrow. Okay, here again, we can evaluate the evidence or the reasons on which one bases an opinion. So if somebody has just a totally frivolous reason for believing that, maybe they decided what to believe by flipping a coin, would that be a strongly supported opinion? No, of course not. Or maybe someone thinks the Cowboys will win the game tomorrow. What if I were to say the Cowboys will win the game tomorrow because blue is my favorite color? Would that be a strongly supported opinion? Would that be an opinion that is strongly supported by evidence or reasons? No, of course not. That would be a very poor reason for believing that is a true statement. On the other hand, if you believe the Cowboys will win the game tomorrow because you've studied the matchups, you've studied how the Cowboys offense will match up against, let's say, the Eagles defense or the Cowboys defense against the Eagles offense, you've studied the statistics on both sides, you've studied the matchup in terms of Philadelphia's secondary versus Dallas's receivers, how well the offense is likely to do in the passing game. You've studied Philadelphia's run defense, and you have a good sense of how well Ezekiel Elliott will match up with how well he'll do against Philadelphia's run defense. If you've studied all these things that are relevant into making a strongly justified opinion about what will happen in the football game, then your opinion is better than the opinion of someone who holds that view for no good reason at all. So it's not as if all opinions are equally good in the sense of equally well supported by evidence or reasons. Students will oftentimes say, well, everyone has a right to their opinion. Well, of course that's true. That's uncontroversial, of course. Everyone knows that. But it doesn't follow from that fact that every opinion is an equally good opinion. Some are better than others. Some are better supported by evidence or reasons than others. So that's another reason why this is not a good argument. Here again, if the argument is this, morality involves matters of opinion, therefore there are no objective moral truths. If that's the argument, again, that's not a good argument for all the reasons that we've gone over now. Sometimes you'll hear someone argue for non-objectivism by pointing out that in the area of morality there is disagreement. However, from the fact that there is disagreement about some matter in morals or values, it doesn't follow that there's no fact of the matter. It doesn't follow that there's no objective truth to be discovered about the subject. Again, it's very easy to show that that's not a valid argument because there are obvious counterexamples to that argument. Here again, there's disagreement in science. Scientists disagree about things all the time, but would you therefore conclude that there are no objective scientific truths? No, no one would. Virtually no one would. Which goes to show that that form of argument is not valid. Here again, there are matters of disagreement in math. Would you therefore conclude that there are no objective mathematical truths to be discovered? No. No one would deny that 2 + 2 = 4. Science, math, they've discovered many objective truths. And yet, at the same time, there is still disagreement in those branches of knowledge as well. There's disagreement in every branch of knowledge. That's why this is not a good argument. Here again, people will look at the fact that on many moral issues, on many ethical issues, society is pretty evenly divided. It'll be like 55% on one side of the issue and 45% on the other side of the issue, or maybe even 50% on one side of the issue and 50% on the other side. It is true that there are some very controversial moral questions in our society. Of course, that's true. And people will look at that fact. They'll look at the fact that there's such strong disagreement on some issues to do with what is morally right and morally wrong. They'll see that there's such strong disagreement and therefore conclude, well, it must be the case that no one's right and no one's wrong. Oftentimes you'll hear people express the non-objectivist view in that way. But is that a conclusion that's really very well supported by that reason? When you think about it here again, it's really not. There's strong disagreement in science about some things and strong disagreement in math about some things. It doesn't follow that there's no knowledge in science and math. And similarly, from the fact that there is a lot of disagreement about morality, it doesn't follow that there's no moral knowledge. Consider these examples. Pluto is a planet. Sirius has undergone a change in color. Water is a compound, not an element. There is a proof of Fermat's last theorem. Okay. With respect to all these statements in science and math, there was disagreement, or there continues to be disagreement. Pluto is a planet. That is a matter of disagreement among astronomers. Astronomers disagree about that. But from the fact that they disagree, of course, it doesn't follow that there's no objective truth to be discovered. It either is or is not a planet. Now, it just is a disagreement just as a consequence of the fact that there's so much that we don't know. And I take it there always will be so much that we don't know. But from the fact that here again, oftentimes we disagree, it doesn't follow that there's no truth to be discovered. It doesn't follow that we haven't learned anything. It doesn't follow that we've attained no knowledge at all. We've acquired an awful lot of knowledge. There's still an awful lot that we don't know as well. So disagreement can't be a good reason. The fact of disagreement can't be a good reason for saying there's no moral knowledge. Sirius has undergone a change in color. That's a matter of disagreement among astronomers. Astronomers and historians of astronomy disagree about that. Some ancient texts suggest that 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the color of Sirius was different from what it is now. But there's disagreement about that. There's debate about that. Other historians of astronomy would say that those sources are not reliable. Maybe they were talking about a different star or something like that. So there's disagreement about that in astronomy. Now here again, from the fact that astronomers disagree, it doesn't follow that there's no objective truth. It either is the case or is not the case that Sirius has undergone a change in color. That statement is either true or false. The fact that there's disagreement about it can't influence the fact of the matter, can't influence whether that statement is true or false. Water is a compound, not an element. That was once a matter of disagreement. Now it is no longer a matter of disagreement. That has been well established now in chemistry for a long time. But as I mentioned before, for most of the history of chemistry, it was thought that water was an element. So when that long-standing view began to be challenged, that was a matter of disagreement. Many scientists disagreed. But from the fact that there was disagreement about that, of course, it doesn't follow that neither party to the disagreement was right. One side was right and the other side was wrong. And it just took time to figure out which side in the disagreement was right. There is a proof of Fermat's last theorem. Here again, that was a matter of disagreement in math for a long time. The 17th century French philosopher Fermat put forward a theorem. There are no whole numbers greater than 2, a, b, c, and n, such that a to the n plus b to the n is equal to c to the n. Okay, that was his theorem, but he had no proof of it. Or if he had proved it, the proof was lost to history. And mathematicians disagreed about that for a long time. It took a long time to prove Fermat's last theorem. That was only proven in my lifetime, actually. As a proof was only discovered in the 1970s. So it took a long time to prove that. So now here again, that whole time that no proof had been discovered, mathematicians disagreed about that. But from the fact that there was disagreement, again, it didn't follow that there was no objective truth to be discovered. When there's a disagreement, all that means is that we don't know which side of the disagreement is in the right. And on some questions, maybe we'll never know. But of course, with respect to a lot of historical disagreements, eventually, we were able to figure out the truth. So that's why this would not be a good argument against objectivism about morality, against the possibility of moral knowledge. Here again, if the argument is, oh, well, people disagree about morality all the time, so there's no objective moral truth. It's just whatever you believe. That's not a good argument, because from the fact that there is disagreement, it doesn't follow that no one is right. Someone very well may be right, we just don't know who it is. And I would add that there is some measure of disagreement about virtually everything. I mean, the internet has really brought this out much more clearly in our own time. Pretty much any statement that you could think to affirm, someone in the world will deny it. And pretty much any statement that you could think to deny, someone in the world will affirm it. So there's some measure of disagreement about everything. In many cases, a very small measure of disagreement, but people disagree about virtually everything. I don't think we should therefore conclude that we have no knowledge. I don't think that would be the right lesson to draw. So just type into Google something as seemingly uncontroversial as the earth is not flat, and like in 1 second, right, you can find thousands of people who will, around the world who will challenge that. I take it that we know that the earth is not flat. Now here again, from the fact that there are people who disagree, what should we really conclude? What lesson should we take from that fact? There's going to be disagreement about everything. So if you're saying that anytime there's disagreement, then no one knows, that would amount to saying that we don't know anything, and that certainly does not seem believable. That certainly does not seem plausible. Sometimes you'll hear somebody argue against the possibility of moral knowledge, argue against objectivism. This way. Sometimes someone arguing for non-objectivism will ask, well, who's to say what's right and wrong? Now, that's a rhetorical question. They don't really mean it as a question. They're implying something when they ask that rhetorical question. They're really saying that because there is no one who has the authority to decree moral truth, that therefore morality isn't objective. So that's the implication when somebody asks that rhetorical question. They're not really asking who's to say as a genuine question. They mean to imply that there is no one who is to say, right? And that's true. There is no one who has the authority to decree what the moral truth is. That's right. But this argument is invalid as an argument against the possibility of moral knowledge. As an argument against objectivism, this is not a valid argument. Here again, it's very easy to think of counterexamples to this argument, arguments of exactly the same form that are obviously invalid. And you can do that on the basis of a very simple observation. There is no one who is to say, so to speak, about empirical matters either. By empirical matters here, I mean branches of knowledge where we verify claims through different kinds of physical observations or procedures or tests, things that we can verify and experience. So by empirical sciences, I would mean sciences like chemistry, biology, astronomy, physics. There isn't anyone who is to say in those areas either. It's not as if something is true because some scientist has said that it's true. It's the other way around. Scientists get to be authorities because they are good at discovering what the truth is. It's not as if it's their saying it that makes it true. So even if it's true that there isn't anyone who has the authority to proclaim what the truth is in morality, again, morality is no different from any other subject matter in this respect. That's why this is not a good argument. There isn't someone in morality who's like an umpire in baseball. Yes, that's true. An umpire in baseball has the authority to say whether the runner is safe or out, for example. Yes, there's nobody like that in morality. There isn't somebody who has the authority to decree or proclaim what the truth is. But that goes for every branch of knowledge. There isn't anyone who is to say that water is H2O. It's not as if some scientist saying it is what makes it true. It's the other way around. People get to be authorities in the sciences because they are good at discovering truth. And when they're trying to discover the truth, they can't find out what the truth is by asking themselves, what do I think? They have to look at the facts and the evidence. So again, consider, there is no one who is to say, in the sense that that argument, when somebody says, well, who's to say? If the person making that argument means by this notion of someone who is to say, here again, an authority who has the power to simply proclaim what the truth is, then of course there's no one who is to say what is right and wrong. But there isn't anyone who is to say what the truth is in any branch of knowledge. So that's not a good argument against objectivism. That's not a good argument against the possibility of moral knowledge. There's no one who is to say that water is H2O. There's no one who is to say that the Earth is the third planet from the sun. The statement water is H2O isn't true because anyone has said that it's true. It isn't true because there's some authority who's empowered to make an official decree or proclamation that it's true. That's not how truth works. Statements are not true because someone has said that they're true. It's the way truth works is the other way around. People who become authorities in the sciences or any area become authorities because they are good at discovering what the truth is, not because they're saying it could somehow make it true. If somebody's saying it could make it true, then we would all be authorities in every branch of knowledge, but obviously that's not true. So here again, if the argument is, well, who's to say what's right and wrong, therefore right and wrong just comes down to the individual's beliefs about it, that is not a good argument for the reasons that we've considered here. Sometimes somebody will, this is a more sophisticated argument than the ones I've considered so far, and it maybe has a little bit more merit to it, but I still think it's not a good argument. Sometimes someone will point to the fact that there isn't any common procedure, any commonly accepted procedure for determining what moral truth is. And that's true. There is no commonly accepted procedure for determining moral truth. So this is a difference between ethics or morality on the one hand and some other branches of knowledge, like physics or chemistry, where there are commonly accepted procedures for determining what the truth is. That is true. That is a difference between some branches of knowledge, like empirical sciences, on the one hand, and morality on the other hand, or ethics on the other hand. It's true, there is no commonly accepted procedure for determining moral truth. Sometimes someone arguing for non-objectivism will point to the absence of such a procedure. But this is not a good argument, because the only way to discover the right procedure is to inquire. We have to try to find out what the truth is before we learn over time which procedures help us to discover the truth. Again, it's not the other way around. It's not as if we know first what the right procedure for discovering truth is and then begin to try to discover the truth. That's never the way that it works. People try to discover the truth first, and it's in the process of trying to discover the truth that over time we learn which procedures work. Procedures for determining truth come to be accepted because they work. It isn't the fact of their acceptance that makes them the right way to determine truth. So here again, there are procedures that you can go through in a chemistry lab for demonstrating that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. But it's not as if that procedure could have been known before people tried to find out what water was made of. It's the other way around. People try to discover the truth first, and over time they learn which procedures work for discovering the truth. And the same may be true about morality. There are different, when it comes to ethics, when it comes to moral knowledge, philosophers disagree about what the best method is. That is true. Philosophers disagree about what is the best method for coming to know moral truth. Some philosophers, for example, give great importance to what they call moral intuition or moral sense. Others give less importance to that and attach more importance to certain empirical facts. So there are different theories about what the right method is for discovering moral truth. But again, procedures for discovering truth come to be accepted over time because they work. It's not as if we could somehow know what the right procedure is first and then start about trying to discover the truth. Consider, for example, at one time there was no commonly accepted procedure for predicting the weather. The ancient Babylonians, for example, used hepatoscopy. So the ancient Babylonians, when they wanted to try to make predictions about what was going to happen with the weather, would slaughter an animal and then inspect the pattern of lines on its liver. That's what this term hepatoscopy means. It's hard to see what the connection would be, right? The connection between the pattern of lines on an animal's liver and meteorological phenomena. It's hard to see what the connection would be, isn't it? So, of course, that procedure didn't work. And that procedure was, of course, eventually abandoned because it didn't work. But here again, it's not as if people could know what the right procedure is for making predictions about the weather. It's not as if they could know what the right procedure was first and then try to do it. That's not the way that truth works. Meteorology, of course, has advanced a lot. Now we do have very good ways of making predictions. Now we do have very reliable procedures for making predictions. But here again, it's not as if those procedures could have somehow been known before people started to find out how to make predictions. It's the other way around. The only way to find out which procedure works is to try to find the truth. The procedure for determining truth can't be discovered first. So if the argument against objectivism is that there's no commonly accepted procedure for determining moral truth, therefore there are no objective moral truths, that's not a good argument. it's oftentimes the case that there's no common procedure for determining truth in many branches of knowledge. But that does not rule out the possibility of our attaining knowledge in those fields. Oftentimes, one will argue against the possibility of moral knowledge. One will argue against the subjectivist position by saying that moral truths aren't absolute. It's sometimes asserted, for example, that moral truths are relative, not absolute. And then one goes on to conclude that there are no objective moral truths, or there is no such thing as objective moral knowledge. It just depends on what the individual believes. That's not a good argument. And it's not a good argument because it's invalid. There are arguments of exactly the same form that are obviously invalid. There are truths in math and science that are not absolute. So if the argument is that moral truths are not absolute, therefore there are no objective moral truths, that's invalid. By that same logic, you could say there are statements in science that are not absolute, therefore there are no objective scientific truths. But that conclusion is obviously false. It's obviously false that we have not discovered anything in science. And yet in science too, there are truths that are not absolute truths. To understand why this is not a good argument, we need to think a little bit critically about this term absolute. What does somebody mean when he or she says that moral truths are relative, not absolute? Absolute has a range of meanings. It could mean certain. It could mean exact. It could mean without exception. It could mean not being relational in any way, not depending on any relational facts. I want to suggest that in each of these senses of the word absolute, there are truths that are not absolute truths in every branch of knowledge. So that can't be a good reason for saying there's no possibility of moral knowledge. Consider this, for example. In 60,000 years, Sirius will be brighter than it is right now. Okay, I think astronomers would agree that that is not an absolute truth. Now, the astronomical evidence for this statement is very strong, and it may be said that we know it. But most astronomers probably would not say that it is certain, in the sense that there's no possibility it could turn out to be false. A meteorite could simply collide with Sirius and simply destroy it. I mean, for one thing, there are any number of reasons that that statement could turn out to be false, right? So I don't think any astronomer would say we know that with certainty. And yet, we do know it. Which just goes to show knowledge doesn't require certainty. Here's a simpler way of understanding this point. Let me just give a simple kind of everyday experience example of this point, that knowledge doesn't require certainty. Consider this more mundane example. Consider the statement, I know where my car is. If I were to ask you right now, do you know where your car is? You would probably think to yourself, yeah. Okay, let's say that you're in the store at the moment. When you're in the store, are you certain that your car hasn't been stolen? It seems very unlikely that you could be certain about that. If it were possible to be certain about that, then presumably no one would ever have their car stolen. Certain in the sense that you can completely rule out the possibility. Here again, when you're in the store, when you're in the mall or whatever, not directly looking at your car, you can rule out the possibility completely that it's been stolen. That certainly seems unlikely. If that were possible, then no one would ever have a car stolen. So no, you can't rule out the possibility. And yet, you do know where your car is. How do we know that in general people do know where their cars are when they're at the store or at the mall or what have you? Well, people pretty much always go back to their car. How do they know where to go? Because they know where their car is. So both things can be true. It can be true that you know where your car is and that you're not certain where your car is. Both things can be true. This is simply a way of making the point that knowledge doesn't require certainty. The notion that knowledge requires certainty is a misconception. It's a common misconception. But in the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge and the nature of knowledge, epistemology, it's a common observation that knowledge doesn't require certainty. So if the argument against objectivism is that moral truths are not absolute truths in the sense of not being absolutely certain, therefore there are no objective moral truths, that's not a good argument. There are many truths that are not certain truths in every branch of knowledge. You know, sometimes, here again, when somebody says moral truths aren't absolute, what they might mean is that moral truths are not absolutely exact. Well, if that's what they mean, here again, that's not a good argument. There are many true statements that are not absolute truths in the sense of being absolutely exact. Consider some of these examples. Pi is equal to 3.14. That's a true statement. Is it an absolute truth in the sense of being absolutely exact truth and absolutely precise truth? No. The value of pi is a repeating decimal that goes on forever. You could always give a more precise, you could always give a more exact statement of the value of pi. You could do that forever. And yet, the statement pi equals 3.14 is true. So it's a truth that is not an absolute truth in the sense of an absolutely exact truth. 2 divided by 7 is equal to 0.2857. That's a true statement. Is it an absolute truth in the sense of an absolutely exact truth? No. Again, that's a repeating decimal. That could go on forever. You could always give a more precise statement of the value of 2 divided by 7. And yet, 2 divided by 7 equals 0.2857. That's a true statement. So here again, many truths are not absolute truths. That's why this isn't a good argument against moral knowledge. Amarillo is 364 miles from Dallas. Let's say that that's true. Is it an absolute truth? No. The statement of any value of length could always be made more precise. The division of space into more and more precise measurements, that could go on forever. I'm sure from Amarillo to Dallas doesn't come out to some exact number of miles. It probably comes out to some numbers of feet as well, and inches, or in the case of metric measurement, millimeters. Of course, you could just go on and on. You could always give a more precise statement of the value of any unit of length. And yet, the statement Amarillo is 364 miles from Dallas is true. Is it an absolute truth? No. And yet it's true. So there are truths in every branch of knowledge that are not absolute truths. That's why this is not a good argument against the possibility of moral knowledge. Moral truths aren't absolute, therefore there are no objective moral truths. Not a good argument. Not a good argument because, again, in every branch of knowledge there are truths that are not absolute truths. Sometimes somebody's saying that moral truths are not absolute. What they might mean in saying that is that there are no moral truths that have no exceptions. Well, even if that is correct, that still isn't a reason to believe that there are no objective moral truths. There are many truths that are not absolute truths in the sense of having no exceptions. Consider, for example, the statement cats have 4 legs. That's a true statement. Is it an absolute truth? No, of course there are exceptions to that. There are cats that have 3 legs, for example. So it's not an absolute truth, and yet it is true. true statements admit of exceptions. There are true statements that do allow of exceptions. That's just in the nature of stating general truths. So that can't be a good reason for rejecting the possibility of moral knowledge or moral truth. Consider the statement, objects fall when they're dropped. Is that true? Yes. Is that an absolute truth? No. If it were some object lighter than air, like a helium balloon, then no, it wouldn't fall. These statements are true, but they aren't absolute in the sense of having no exceptions. So even if no statements about morality are absolute in this sense of having no exceptions, it wouldn't follow from that fact that there are no true statements about morality. When someone says moral truths are not absolute, they might mean that there are no moral truths that are not relational in some way or another. What do I mean by relational? Well, a relational truth is a truth that depends on the relation between two things. So say, for example, from my point of view, the pen is to the left of the book. That would be an example of a relational truth. A statement like the pen is to the left of the book, of course that can't be an absolute truth because it's a relational kind of claim. Whether the pen is to the left of the book does depend on point of view. That is a truth that depends on a point of view. But even relational truths are true in some sense. We simply have to specify what the relevant relation is. So if the argument is that there are no moral truths that are absolute truths, in the sense of not being relational in any way, therefore there are no objective moral truths, that's not a good argument. Because there are many relational truths. A statement, let's consider an example in morality. A statement such as killing is morally permissible, for example, may be true when we specify the relevant relation, the relevant relational circumstance. So at first glance, the statement killing is morally permissible would appear to be false. But then when you specify a relation to a specific circumstance, such as in self-defense, oh, okay, well that revised version of the statement appears to be true. I think most of us would agree killing is morally permissible in self-defense. So killing is morally permissible is a true statement once we provide a certain, once we clarify a certain relation of the statement to a specific circumstance. Killing is morally permissible is certainly not an absolute truth, of course. No one would think, no one with moral common sense would think that killing is morally permissible is an absolute truth. But once you build into the statement the relevant relation, in this case, in relation to the circumstance of self-defense, then, oh, yeah, okay, that's true. That's an objective truth. It's an objective truth that has to do with being related to a specific circumstance. So it is a kind of relational truth. But it is true. So even relational truths are true in some sense. They're not true in the sense of being absolutely true, but they are true.